I remember watching a politician give a speech a while back that it just perfectly captured the strange atmosphere of modern Japan. He stood there with this look of absolute moral certainty, his voice trembling with conviction as he declared that even proposing a spy prevention law would be the road to war.
Wow.
To him and to the nodding crowd, the mere act of guarding a national secret was a form of aggression. It was a beautiful, almost hypnotic sentiment. This idea that if we simply refuse to acknowledge the tools of conflict, conflict itself will just, cease to exist.
It's a very idealistic view.
Very. But then you look at the reality on the ground, and the scene becomes much more unsettling. In the halls of government and the high-rises of Tokyo, Japan has earned a nickname that sounds like a joke but isn't: the spy's paradise.
Right.
It is a place where the intelligence system is so porous, it's practically a sieve, yet any attempt to plug the holes is met with immediate, fierce condemnation.
Yeah, that backlash is a key part of the story.
I've spoken to people who truly believe that discussing deterrence or defense is a return in militarism, as if talking about a fire extinguisher is the same thing as starting a fire. That instantaneous shift from a noble desire for peace to a total shutdown of critical thought is what's so striking.
It's an emotional response, not a rational one.
Exactly. We've reached a point where no to war isn't just a slogan anymore, it's a conversation stopper. It's a way to avoid the messy, difficult work of actual security. What was originally intended as a shield to protect a recovering nation has, over the decades, calcified into a rigid taboo. By treating the very idea of prevention as a forbidden subject, we've created this bizarre paradox. A nation so committed to peace that it has made itself a defenseless, open invitation for aggression.
Right.
The question isn't whether we want peace. Everyone does. The question is why we've become so afraid to defend it. Okay, let's unpack this. That paradox, the one where a commitment to peace creates strategic vulnerability, is the core mission of this deep dive. We are exploring the legal void that defines the spy's paradise, the psychological roots of this intense anti-defense taboo within Japanese society, and the current strategic necessity forcing a profound move toward active self-protection in this increasingly complex geopolitical environment.
Yeah.
You are going to see how a constitutional ideal transformed into a massive strategic liability and what it's taking to change that.
And if we want to understand the modern shift, we have to start with that foundational vulnerability. The nickname, the spy's paradise, it's rooted in a very specific legal and historical reality.
Okay.
For decades, right up until the early 2010s, Japan was structurally porous. We were talking about an industrial powerhouse, a key U.S. ally, where there were effectively no dedicated, meaningful criminal penalties for espionage.
No penalties at all.
Or for civil servants or others handing over classified government or defense material to a foreign power. It just wasn't really a crime of the books.
That's almost impossible to grasp. So you're saying if a foreign intelligence officer was caught red-handed stealing, blueprints for a new jet, what would happen?
They might face a minor charge, but nothing that matched the scale of the strategic damage.
So, trespassing.
Precisely. If they were lucky, they might be charged with trespassing or a minor breach of the civil service law. But the fundamental crime of undermining national security through intelligence gathering simply did not exist.
Which means the risk was incredibly low for them.
Exactly. This lack of an internal deterrent made Tokyo a uniquely attractive and low-risk environment for intelligence collection. And this wasn't just a theoretical vulnerability, it led to systemic penetration.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. What is the definitive historical proof that this legal void led to systemic capture rather than just isolated incidents?
The definitive proof comes from the 1979 defection of a KGB major named Stanislav Levchenko. Okay. Levchenko had been operating in Tokyo for years under journalistic cover. When he defected to the United States, he handed over a list that confirmed Japan's vulnerability in devastating detail.
What was on the list?
He exposed a network of approximately 200 agents working directly for the KGB.
200 agents? That sounds like a full-scale institutional operation, not just a casual ring.
It was far beyond casual. Levchenko exposed agents who were deeply embedded in the Japanese establishment.
What kind of people are we talking about?
His list included academics, high-ranking government officials, industrialists, and most crucially, the head of the then powerful Japan Socialist Party.
The head of a major political party? Wow.
Yeah. This was confirmation that Moscow viewed Japan not just as a listening post, but as a target for deep political manipulation. The damage was extensive, compromising political decision-making, economic planning, and critically, Japan's security posture relative to its American allies.
I can imagine.
The sheer scale of the penetration was a massive shock to the Western intelligence community, and it contributed directly to the U.S. view of Japan as an intelligence liability throughout the later Cold War decades.
The willingness of the Japanese system to just look away, even when faced with catastrophic breaches like that, is what's so telling about that post-war culture.
And that unwillingness goes back much further. I mean, consider the case of Kozo Izumi, which predates Levchenko by decades.
Okay, who was he?
Izumi was a Japanese diplomat stationed in the Soviet Union in the 1940s. He was targeted and eventually recruited, often described as falling into a long, slow honey trap. He was compromised and eventually married his landlady's daughter, becoming a paid Soviet agent for 10 years. And his treason was monumental. He supplied Soviet intelligence with Japanese diplomatic and military codebook.
Providing codebook? I mean, that is almost the worst thing an intelligence asset can give away. It compromises communication across the entire state until the codes are changed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And potentially forever if the methodology is revealed. One analysis from the time suggested that Izumi's contribution to Soviet intelligence was considered greater than that of the legendary wartime spy, Richard Sorge.
So, a huge betrayal.
Monumental. Yet, when Izumi was exposed by a Soviet defector in 1954 and repatriated, he was never prosecuted in Japan.
He wasn't.
Nope. The authorities essentially chose to ignore the case. This non-action highlights the depth of the national reluctance, that foundational anti-militarism that viewed any aggressive anti-espionage action as a dangerous step backward toward the wartime state.
So the desire to maintain the national narrative of post-war innocence outweighed the need for strategic self-defense.
That's a good way to put it, yes.
It makes you wonder if Japan's greatest vulnerability wasn't just the secrets it lost, but the way foreign powers used disinformation to control the global perception of Japan.
Disinformation is an ancient weapon, but Japan was uniquely exposed to it due to its historical sensitivities. The prime historical example is the infamous Tanaka Memorial.
Tanaka Memorial, right.
This document, supposedly written by Prime Minister Jichi Tanaka in the late 1920s, laid out a chilling step-by-step plan for Japanese global domination. It claimed, and I'm quoting here, "To conquer the world, Japan must first conquer China."
That sounds like an explicit declaration of intent, tailor-made to incite fear and hostility in the U.S. and China.
It was a perfect piece of psychological warfare, but it was a forgery.
It wasn't real.
Not at all. Although experts debate its exact origin, likely Soviet intelligence or Chinese nationalists, it was an external intelligence operation designed to shape the global understanding of Japanese actions. The internal clues betrayed its origin. No original Japanese language version was ever found, and the Chinese translation contained phrasing errors unlikely to be used by a senior Japanese statesman.
But the reality of the document didn't matter, did it? Its effect was what counted.
Absolutely. It was translated, widely disseminated, and became what analysts called a superb propaganda weapon. Crucially, it shaped the narrative of World War II. It even appeared in U.S. propaganda films like Frank Capra's 1944 movie, Know Your Enemy, Japan.
And what did it do there?
It reinforced the American view that the attack on Pearl Harbor was not a desperate strategic choice, but part of a long-planned Hitlerian path toward world conquest.
And the ghost of this forgery is still active today, right? I mean, this isn't just a historical footnote.
It's still being used to sow distrust.
Yeah.
Decades later, this forged document is still taught in some regions, notably in Russia, as if it were an authentic historical declaration.
Wow.
It just demonstrates how historical disinformation, uncorrected by robust counterintelligence, can manipulate global perceptions of a nation's intentions for nearly a century. This passive approach to narrative defense left Japan vulnerable to being permanently framed as an inherently aggressive state.
Which complicates its modern diplomatic efforts, I imagine.
To say the least.
If that's the historical context, the legal vulnerability must be even more dangerous today, given the acceleration of technological and economic espionage. I encountered an example that really drove home how this legal gap affects national innovation right now. Think about the high-value sectors. Robotics, cutting-edge materials, next-generation semiconductor technology, where Japan is a global leader.
Right.
We heard about a scenario involving a mid-level researcher at a high-tech firm in Minato, Tokyo. This researcher discovers that a foreign consultant, hired ostensibly for market analysis, has actually been systematically extracting sensitive data.
What kind of data?
Patents, proprietary source code, next-generation blueprints. the works. When the company investigates and goes to the police, the investigation just hits a wall.
Let me guess. No law to prosecute under.
Exactly. The frustrating conclusion is that because there is no comprehensive anti-espionage law that covers foreign acquisition of sensitive economic or technological secrets, this activity, which is clearly an act of economic warfare, is stuck in a legal loophole.
It's a gray zone.
A complete gray zone. The consultant didn't steal a military secret per se, but they stole the core of Japan's economic future.
That is the modern strategic vulnerability in a nutshell. Economic espionage targeting intellectual property and patents is now arguably more damaging than military espionage because the entire foundation of the Yoshida Doctrine was built on economic recovery and technological supremacy.
So if you can't protect your IP, the whole strategy falls apart.
Right. And that gap finally created enough internal and external pressure to force a political response. The passage of the Act on the Protection of Specially Designated Secrets, or the SSL.
The introduction of the state secrecy law in 2013-2014 was a massive political undertaking. And it's crucial to note this wasn't really an internal epiphany, was it? It was largely driven by pressure from the United States.
That's right. As alliance cooperation deepened, particularly on joint defense systems and shared military equipment, Washington became increasingly uncomfortable with Japan's leaky system.
They didn't trust them with secrets.
The U.S. insisted that if Japan wanted to be a full trusted partner, capable of receiving and maintaining sensitive military technology, it had to demonstrate credible counterintelligence capabilities. The SSL was, in many ways, a necessary concession to maintain the integrity of the U.S. security alliance.
So, after decades of refusing to engage, what did the SSL finally introduce? What were the mechanics designed to plug these holes?
The law grants the government power to designate information pertaining to 4 key areas: defense, diplomacy, public safety, and counterterrorism as specially designated secrets, or SDS.
And once designated?
Once designated, these documents can be locked away for extraordinary lengths of time, up to 60 years.
And the categories of SDS are highly specific, I assume, reflecting what had been unprotected before.
Precisely. Under defense, the secrets include the operational readiness of the self-defense forces, specific defense intelligence like collected signal intelligence or imagery cryptology methods, and weapon specifications.
So all the really sensitive stuff.
Right. In diplomacy, it covers national security negotiation strategies. Crucially, the law also formalized protection for information related to counterintelligence and counterterrorism methods, closing the gap that had allowed people like Levchenko to operate with impunity.
And the penalties finally gave the law teeth, distinguishing between an accidental leak and willful espionage.
Penalties were significantly ramped up. A civil servant who intentionally leaks SDS faces up to 10 years in prison.
Okay.
And anyone, including civilians or journalists, who aids in the leak or acquires the secret through fraud, theft, or unauthorized intrusion to benefit a foreign country, faces up to 10 years. This was the moment Japan formally attempted to transition from the spy's paradise to a modern security state.
But the moment the law was proposed, the resistance was visceral. You mentioned the public backlash was fierce, citing fears of returning to pre-war oppression.
The backlash was immense. I think something like 80% of the public opposed the law. The immediate fear was of the return of the Kemitai.
The military police?
Yes, the highly repressive military police of the pre-war and wartime eras. The Kempeitai was notorious for using vague laws to arrest and prosecute dissenters, journalists, and anyone deemed unpatriotic, leading to arbitrary detention and political suppression.
So for many people, the SSL looked like the first step back toward that repressive state.
Exactly.
So the law was perceived not just as a security measure, but as an attack on post-war democracy itself.
Absolutely. Critics highlighted that the definition of what constitutes a state secret remained vague, giving too much discretionary power to the executive branch. Media groups, including Reporters Without Borders, reacted by lowering Japan's global press freedom ranking.
Why? What was their main concern?
They warned that the law would lead to an increase in self-control and even self-censorship among journalists covering government affairs. The irony is that the law designed to protect Japan's secrets ended up raising serious questions about the health of its democracy.
And the challenges haven't stopped with the law's passage. I mean, implementing it and creating a genuine counterintelligence culture is a far bigger project.
It is a massive institutional lift, especially regarding personnel security. The law requires a new security clearance system, personnel security screening, or PSS, for anyone handling SDS.
Which is not a small thing.
No. This process involves intense vetting of family members, financial history, and personal connections, which is culturally very intrusive in Japan. Furthermore, the government has struggled to effectively designate and manage SDS across multiple ministries, leading to classification mistakes and confusion.
And we've seen high-profile failures, confirming that simply having the law doesn't solve the problem of institutional habit.
The most salient example was the 2022 charging of a Japanese maritime self-defense force captain.
Right.
He was arrested for leaking highly classified U.S.-acquired intelligence, as well as specific data related to Chinese ships operating near Japanese waters.
Which is a huge deal.
It was a profound embarrassment, because it directly undermined the very U.S. alliance trust the SSL was created to protect. It confirmed that the historical porosity persists. The new legal structure is still battling decades of lax security culture.
So, Section 1 established the legal and strategic symptoms, the spy's paradise reality. Now we need to dive into the cause, which is the cultural structure that allowed this vulnerability to exist for so long.
That structure is defined by the Yoshida Doctrine, the post-war policy foundation. This doctrine was a pragmatic response to defeat, formulated by Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida.
And the core idea was?
The core trade-off was simple. Japan would maintain the constitutional renunciation of war, Article 9, and rely almost completely on the U.S. security alliance for defense. In exchange, Japan would minimize domestic defense spending and efforts, pouring all its energy and resources into rapid economic recovery.
It was a conscious decision to outsource security risk to prioritize prosperity.
It created a singular focus. Economic recovery as the definition of national success. This policy framework simultaneously allowed for a very specific type of pacifist culture to flourish, one that wasn't rooted in, Western philosophical or religious nonviolence, but in sheer raw survival.
You call this fear-induced pacifism. How was this fear cultivated and institutionalized in the national identity?
It was born directly from the horrific suffering of World War II, specifically the hibakusha, the atomic bomb victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Their suffering became the central, powerful, and unifying national myth after the defeat.
Never again.
Exactly. The never again sentiment was profoundly practical. It was a determination to protect their own well-being and local communities from any repeat of that catastrophic suffering. The narrative fixated on the Japanese as victims of atomic tragedy.
So the identity of victimhood became the shield.
It did. Scholars like James Orr noted that atomic victimhood became the first powerfully unifying national myth after defeat. This victim narrative was actively perpetuated through literature, film, and critically, institutions like the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. The museum was crucial in shaping national memory, powerfully integrating the experience of Hiroshima into the national ideology of victimhood, which then justified the political taboo against military discussion.
Initially, however, the education system tried to foster a deeper, more critical pacifism that acknowledged Japan's role as perpetrator, not just victim.
That's a crucial distinction. The immediate post-war education reforms were radical. The Ministry of Education documents from that period were openly repentant, emphasizing democratization and openly discussing war responsibility.
What did they say?
They stated Japan must apologize most humbly to the world for the sins they have committed, even critically examining the emperor's wartime role. This created a strong foundation for critical, self-reflective peace education.
But that foundation began to crack under Cold War political pressure.
Right. Once the Cold War heated up, the conservative Liberal Democratic Party government began a systematic, gradual campaign to sanitize history. They favored a curriculum that emphasized nationalism and patriotism.
A process of selective historical amnesia.
Yes. It meant that critical appraisals of Japan's war responsibility were gradually censored or downplayed in textbooks, shifting the focus from national guilt to national pride and resilience.
And the institutional defenders of that critical peace education were losing their power base at the same time.
Exactly. The Japan Teachers Union, Nikkyoso, had been the principal guardian of progressive peace education, fighting fiercely against the Ministry of Education's push for patriotic curricula.
They were powerful.
In the 1950s and 60s, they were a massive force. But their influence waned dramatically as affluence grew in the 70s and 80s, reducing the incentive for teachers to join. Subsequent generations of teachers just lacked the same personal, visceral sense of mission as those who had experienced the war.
So their power base eroded.
And the Ministry of Education, through its control over textbook approval, slowly and deliberately eroded Nikkyoso's countervailing power.
this cultural fragmentation wasn't limited to the schools. It paralyzed the organized peace movement itself, leading to its irrelevance.
Yes. The mass movement against war and nuclear proliferation, centered around the Gensuikyo, imploded due to crippling ideological infighting. The movement, initially nonpartisan, became a battleground between the Japan Socialist Party and the Japanese Communist Party.
What was the specific ideological friction that caused the fracture?
Well, the JSP championed a neutral stance, what they called positive neutrality, focusing on non-alignment and diplomatic resolution. The JCP, however, pushed a profoundly ideological peace force thesis.
Which
essentially viewed the Soviet Union as the global force for peace and the U.S. as the imperialist enemy. So they were fighting over who the real global enemy was and how peace should be defined.
And this constant public bickering just discredited the movement?
It did. Conservatives successfully painted the entire peace movement as being hijacked for partisan, sometimes even overtly anti-American political gain, significantly reducing its mass appeal and effectiveness.
So we have sanitized education, a fragmented movement, and time passing. This all combined to create a profound generational shift, pushing the memory of suffering further and further away.
Exactly. The emotional currency of never again diluted over time. There is now a widely acknowledged national crisis of oblivion to the Hiroshima memory.
What does that look like?
Younger generations, growing up in unparalleled affluence under the safety of the U.S. umbrella, often lack a comprehension of the hardship and severity of the war. We see this manifested in the declining appeal of peace memorials and, disturbingly, even instances of students vandalizing the famous paper cranes associated with the Sadako Sasaki. The past has become abstract.
And abstract memories don't create the necessary urgency for critical thought. The trauma of the 20th century calcified into a social mechanism that prevented rational security discussion in the 21st. I found the anecdote of Dr. Arata particularly striking because it shows how quickly civil discourse breaks down. This university professor attempted to organize a seminar, not a political rally, but an academic seminar on maritime deterrence and the contemporary role of the self-defense forces.
So a rational discussion.
It was meant to be a professional, rational discussion about defense policy. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The event was met with protests, and the professor was personally labeled a militarist and a traitor to peace. The rhetoric was designed not to debate, but to shame and silence. This incident perfectly illustrates how the ingrained fear of the past has transformed into an emotional deadlock, where the mere act of analyzing security needs is equated with advocating for military aggression.
The power of that social taboo is why the country remained strategically inert for decades, despite being a major global power. The political system simply could not bear the social cost of that conversation.
How, then, does a nation constrained by such deep cultural inertia move forward? That brings us to Section 3. The strategic pivot that is currently underway, forcing Japan from passive pacifism to active deterrence. What finally broke the Yoshida Doctrine?
The Yoshida Doctrine broke because the fundamental assumptions underpinning it collapsed. The moment the U.S.-Sino power shift accelerated and China began deploying gray zone tactics.
What do you mean by gray zone?
Actions below the threshold of full military conflict. So things like constant Coast Guard incursions into Japanese territorial waters or aggressive fishing fleet deployments. When that started happening, the U.S. security umbrella suddenly felt less comprehensive.
And then there's North Korea.
Right. Coupled with North Korea's relentless nuclear and missile development, the stability Japan had relied upon just vanished. Pacifism was no longer an option. It was a recipe for strategic surrender.
The national security environment became too dangerous to ignore. How is that realization formally codified?
In December 2022, the government released the new National Security Strategy, or NSS, an epoch-making document that formally declared the old era over.
The language must be pretty stark.
It's unmistakable. The NSS recognizes the current security environment as the most severe and complex in the post-war era. This is a complete departure from the previous strategies, which prioritize globalization and cooperation as guarantees of peace. The new strategy acknowledges that strength is necessary to maintain stability.
What does the new NSS prioritize beyond just military defense?
The goal is to strengthen comprehensive national power. This is a holistic concept that integrates defense capabilities with diplomacy, economic security, technology innovation, and intelligence.
Okay, so a whole-of-government approach.
Exactly. Japan is now explicitly pursuing strategic autonomy. the ability to act independently in its own defense, and strategic indispensability, ensuring it remains a crucial and active contributor to regional security, thereby making its security non-negotiable for its allies.
Let's discuss the most profound shift, which is military. The permitted acquisition of a counterattack capability. I mean, this sounds like a fundamental constitutional challenge.
It's a deliberate, profound shift. Under the old interpretation of Article 9, renouncing war, Japan was essentially limited to passive self-defense, meaning only intercepting incoming threats.
Right.
The new NSS permits the acquisition of systems capable of effective counterstrikes against an opponent's launch sites or command centers. The goal is deterrence by punishment, not just deterrence by denial.
What does that capability look like on the ground? What are they actually buying?
It involves upgrading existing indigenous systems, notably the Type 12 surface-to-ship missile, to extend its range and deploy it from various platforms. More controversially, it involves the planned acquisition of American Tomahawk cruise missiles.
Tomahawks, that's a huge step.
Acquiring long-range strike weapons like the Tomahawk, which can reach deep into continental Asia, was unthinkable just a few years ago. The government has had to engage in intense legal gymnastics to argue that using this capability is purely defensive and compatible with Article 9.
How do they make that argument?
By stating it would only be used if an attack on Japan or its allies were imminent and no other defensive measures were available.
So the philosophy driving this military shift is proactive contribution to peace. What does that mean in practice, beyond just deterrence?
It is a conceptual shift away from the reactive and passive pacifism of the Yoshida Doctrine. Proactive contribution to peace means Japan is actively securing peace based on international cooperation and contribution. It frames defense capability not as a goal in itself, but as a necessary means to ensure regional stability.
And how is Japan leveraging its economic and diplomatic power to fulfill this proactive role?
A key part of this is through Official Development Assistance, or ODA, which is now strategically focused on human security, providing freedom from fear and want.
So they're using aid strategically?
Yes. They're directing ODA towards strengthening coast guards, providing patrol vessels, and offering capacity-building assistance to Asian and Pacific Island countries in areas like disaster relief and counter-piracy operations. This engagement demonstrates that Japan is a stabilizing force, actively contributing to the region's security architecture rather than just relying on the U.S. to do so.
This push for comprehensive national power and greater regional contribution inevitably brings up the critical intelligence question. Formal integration into the Five Eyes intelligence sharing alliance.
The debate over Japan becoming the sixth eye, alongside the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, has one of the most visible indicators of this strategic pivot. Former Defense Minister Kono Taro expressed clear interest in 2020, recognizing that deep intelligence sharing is vital for modern deterrence.
Why does the yes argument for Japanese inclusion hold such weight strategically?
Well, Tokyo's strategic perceptions are nearly perfectly aligned with the Five Eyes on the two primary regional threats: China's expansion and North Korea's nuclear instability.
And they bring assets to the table.
Invaluable specialized assets, particularly its signals intelligence or SIGINT capabilities, which have been built up systematically over the post-war period, focused intensely on its immediate neighbors. This vast, if previously understated, intelligence gathering framework holds data that Five Eyes desperately needs to form a complete operational picture of the Indo-Pacific.
But the no argument circles right back to the very first section of our deep dive, the spy's paradise vulnerability.
It is the single largest hurdle. Critics within the existing Five Eyes nations argue that until Japan's counterintelligence structure is completely hardened, formal membership is too great a security liability. Remember, the 1955 UK-USA agreement mandates that intelligence must be shared continuously, currently, and without request.
Which requires absolute trust.
Total trust. And the concerns are twofold.
What are those specific concerns about Japan's internal security?
First, personnel security. While the SSL introduced a vetting system, critics question the thoroughness and cultural acceptance of the deep background checks required for the highest clearance levels. Second, industrial security.
The private contractors.
Right. Much of the sensitive technology is held by private contractors, and critics argue the regulatory and legal framework protecting those industrial secrets is still too lax, making the entire defense industrial base a soft target for economic espionage. An alliance is only as effective as its weakest link.
And Japan has historically been that link.
Exactly.
Given that the alliance clearly needs Tokyo's SIGINT assets, Is the perceived liability just a convenient excuse for Five Eyes to avoid the political complications of adding a sixth member? Or is the security risk genuinely prohibitive?
It's likely a mix of both. The risk is genuine, as the 2022 JMSDF leak proved. However, there are political barriers too. Adding Japan could complicate the alliance's structure and set an awkward precedent.
You mean other countries would want in?
Potentially, yeah. Other close allies like South Korea or even India might seek formal inclusion, which would dilute the exclusivity of the core club.
So what's the pragmatic resolution being pursued?
For now, Tokyo already enjoys a de facto Five Eyes Plus status.
What does that mean?
It means they participate in controlled, fluid, and specific intelligence sharing on a case-by-case basis where necessary, particularly concerning tactical threats from North Korea. This arrangement enhances Japanese security and provides the necessary intelligence flow to the alliance without fully integrating the historical weak link into the deepest, most sensitive level of the Five Eyes structure.
So it's a necessary intermediate step while Japan works to professionalize its counterintelligence culture.
Precisely.
The need for active protection isn't just about Tomahawk missiles or intelligence alliances. It's a fundamental evolution in national identity, moving past historical trauma towards self-responsibility. This national transition from passive hope to active defense, a profoundly difficult psychological process, one that moves from the halls of power right down to the local community. Consider the quiet, elderly craftsman living in a small coastal city, the kind of place where neighborhood order and safety are sacrosanct. For his entire life, he upheld the ideal of passive peace.
Right.
He believed that if Japan simply refused to engage with the tools of conflict, the high-trust world he cherished, the one where doors can be left unlocked and public spaces are perfectly safe, would remain untouched.
But the world changed around him.
Exactly. As regional aggression grows and China's gray zone activities push closer to home, this cracksman faces a sobering realization. The unique Japanese way of life, that alternative modernity defined by order and safety, is not guaranteed. To protect the sanctity of his neighborhood, the nation must transition to active deterrence. This is the messy, difficult truth. True peace in the 21st century requires strength, vigilance, and self-responsibility, not just passive hope.
That analogy of protecting the high-trust society captures the transition perfectly. And to fully understand the profound difficulty of this transition, we need to analyze why the psychological resistance, that intense taboo against discussing defense, is so deeply embedded. We can use a fascinating cultural mirror, how major Japanese corporations have chosen to present their own wartime history.
The concept of organizational amnesia seems to be at play here, where institutions strategically forget uncomfortable parts of their past.
Precisely. We can compare two major commercial vehicle manufacturers, Isuzu in Japan and Volvo in Sweden. Both companies are industrial giants with deep roots in wartime production, but they approach the presentation of that history and their relationship with the military in radically different ways.
And this reflects the national security taboo.
Perfectly.
Okay, let's start with Volvo, which embraces candor and transparency in its narrative.
Volvo's museum in Sweden exemplifies the explicit historical narrative. The company is transparent about its founders, Assar Gabrielsen and Gustav Larsson, displaying detailed biographies and celebrating them as heroic individuals who shaped the company. They also boast about technological breakthroughs like the iconic experimental safety car.
Right.
And critically, Volvo was candid about its military involvement.
They don't try to sanitize their wartime profits or contributions.
Not at all. The museum openly displays the engine made for the Swedish Air Force's Saab 37 Viggen fighter jet. The corporate narrative explicitly states that during World War II, when consumer sales dried up, the military was a crucial customer.
So they admit it.
They celebrate it. Corporate documents confirm the entire period was a golden time for the company's development, with extensive funding provided directly by state and defense authorities. For Volvo, military contribution is integrated into the story of technological growth and national service. There was no shame, just factual history.
Now let's contrast that with Isuzu, a corporation that has been just as central to Japan's industrial and military history.
Isuzu's museum, the Isuzu Plaza, presents a meticulously curated and highly selective narrative. The theme focuses intensely on transporting day-to-day lives, positioning the company solely as a contributor to civil society.
Okay.
The narrative emphasizes earnest innovation achieved through foreign technological imports and collaborations, avoiding any mention of indigenous military development.
When you conduct a gap analysis against the Volvo model, What are the most glaring omissions that signal this organizational amnesia?
There are three critical omissions. First, D'Souza's exhibit contains no individuals. There are no biographies of founders, engineers, or executives. The historical narrative is entirely depersonalized.
Interesting. What's the second?
Second, while the company touts innovation, it completely avoids specifying which technology drove its success. There's no deep dive into a specific inventor or a key technological breakthrough. It remains frustratingly vague.
And the third gap, which is the most relevant to our discussion, is the relationship with the military.
The official chronology at the Isuzu Plaza is extremely circumscribed regarding the war. It states that the predecessor company was placed under the control of the Army and designated to manufacture military vehicles and engines until the end of WWII.
That wording, placed under the control of, sounds very passive.
It's very carefully worded. It's designed to imply coercion, that they were an unwilling participant forced into service by the wartime state.
But the hidden corporate documents tell a very different story, suggesting active collaboration.
They do. Isuzu's collaboration with the government, both leading up to and during WWII, was comprehensive and deep. They produced critical military vehicles, like the Type 97 Chiha medium tank engine, and specialized military trucks like the Type 94, all of which are strategically omitted from the museum.
So it's a conscious choice.
It's a conscious act of airbrushing the past. It prevents inconvenient questions about the intimate, necessary ties between the wartime state and industrial complex.
So this institutional behavior, the deliberate refusal to confront the difficult, messy history of the state-industry relationship, is the corporate mirror of the national psychological taboo against defense discussion.
Precisely. If major corporations, which were essential pillars of the war machine, refuse to acknowledge their own history of deep collaboration, it reinforces the political impulse to label any discussion of defense or military capability as an abnormal return to militarism. The silence in the corporate museum validates the conversation stopper in the political sphere. It allowed the spy's paradise vulnerability to persist because confronting it required confronting the uncomfortable historical truth.
This deep dive has shown that the spy's paradise nickname and Japan's legal and strategic vulnerabilities are merely symptoms of a profound self-imposed constraint. The question is no longer whether peace is desirable, but whether a nation can afford to equate critical thought about security, about deterrence, with the specter of militarism.
And the external necessity of geopolitics, particularly the rise of China and instability in North Korea, has finally forced Japan's hand. The policy pivot, exemplified by the new national security strategy and the pragmatic drive toward Five Eyes cooperation, is forcing the transition beyond rhetorical passive pacifism. This is the messy, difficult work of moving toward active self-defense and securing its future by taking responsibility for its own security.
Instead of ending with the noble desire for peace that defined the post-war era, we must recognize that the ultimate challenge now facing Japan is the realization that the high-trust social order, the alternative modernity the nation cherishes, cannot survive in the 21st century merely by refusing to talk about the tools necessary to defend it.